She came to Montana with a suitcase full of lies. Not the kind that ruin a person, the kind that save them. Evelyn Hart stepped off that stagecoach in 1875 with a practiced smile, a borrowed name, and enough secrets buried in her luggage to get her hanged, arrested, or dragged back east in chains, depending on who found her first. The man waiting for her had never met a woman like her in his life. He just didn't know it yet. And somewhere back in Boston, a very powerful, very dangerous man was already saddling his horse. If you've been waiting for a story that hits different, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this reaches. Hit that like button and let's get into it. The stagecoach came in late. It always did on the Billings run. Everyone in Harrow Creek knew that. But Sawyer Callahan had been standing at the edge of the road for the better part of an hour anyway, hat in hand, boots sinking slow into the half-frozen mud, like the ground itself was trying to talk him out of this whole idea. He was 34 years old. He owned 800 acres. He had a good well, 2 solid barns, and a cattle operation that kept the books in the black even through the hard winters. By every measure a man on the Montana frontier could count, Sawyer Callahan was doing fine. He just hadn't spoken to a woman. Not a real conversation, not one that meant something, in close to 3 years. That wasn't the reason he'd placed the advertisement. He told himself it wasn't, anyway. Seeking a practical arrangement, the ad had said. Rancher, 34, Montana Territory, requires a capable partner for frontier life. Not romance. Partnership. Women of good character and constitution only. He'd written and rewritten that last line 4 times. Not romance. As if putting it in ink made it true. As if he wasn't standing here in the November cold turning his hat brim around and around in his hands like some green boy at his first dance. The stagecoach rolled around the bend, throwing up a spray of half-frozen road muck, and Sawyer shoved his hat back on his head and straightened up. He had exchanged 3 letters with Evelyn Hart of Boston, Massachusetts. She'd written in a clean hand, direct sentences, no nonsense. She'd told him she was 28, that she had no family left to speak of, that she was not afraid of hard work or harsh weather, and that she expected the same honesty from him that she intended to provide. She had not asked about his finances. She had not asked if he was handsome. He'd liked her for that. The stage creaked to a stop. The driver climbed down, hauled the door open, and 2 passengers got out. A barrel-shaped man in a wool coat who immediately started arguing about his luggage, and then a woman who stepped down without waiting for help, one hand on the doorframe, the other clutching the strap of a large leather bag that hung across her body like she'd sooner lose a limb than let go of it. Sawyer looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Not a question. She'd apparently known him on sight. He wasn't sure what that said about him. "Miss Hart." He nodded. "Welcome to Harrow Creek." She looked at the town. 1 street, a general store, a livery, a saloon, a church with a cracked bell tower, and 6 or 7 other buildings that hadn't quite decided what they wanted to be. "Thank you," she said, in a tone that suggested she was still making up her mind whether the word applied. Her trunks were heavy. Not regular heavy, the way a woman's trunks were heavy with dresses and household things. These were dense, the kind of weight that came from books and tools, the kind that made the stagecoach driver grunt and set one down with more care than he'd used on anything else all day. "Careful with that one," Evelyn said, sharp and immediate, before the trunk had even fully left his hands. The driver gave her a look. She gave him one back. He was careful with it. Sawyer loaded everything into the wagon bed himself, and he noticed the weight, and he said nothing about it, because it wasn't his business what a woman packed. They rode the 4 miles out to the ranch in something that could charitably be called a comfortable quiet, and was actually 2 people measuring each other in their peripheral vision and pretending not to. The ranch came into view around the last bend. A long, low house with a covered porch, 2 big barns painted red, and a 3rd structure that Sawyer had started building and never quite finished, standing off to the east like a half-kept promise. "The house is bigger than I expected," Evelyn said. "Built it to last." He guided the horses through the gate. "The east room's yours. You can do with it what you need." "The east room. Separate from mine," he said, quickly. "I put that in the 3rd letter. If you want, if there's anything, I meant what I wrote. Practical arrangement." She was quiet a moment. "I know what you meant, Mr. Callahan." "Sawyer." She turned her head toward him for the first time since they'd left town. In the fading afternoon light, her eyes were a shade of gray that didn't quite settle on any one color. She looked tired in the way that wasn't about sleep, the kind of tired that came from carrying something a long time. "Evelyn," she said. He gave her space that first evening. He made supper himself. Not well, it had to be said, because Sawyer Callahan cooked the way a man cooks when there's nobody else to do it. Salt pork and hardtack, and a pot of beans that had been on the fire since morning and had given up all dignity. He put it on the table and knocked on her door and said supper was ready. She came to the table. She ate without complaint, which impressed him. "The beans are overdone," he said, because he felt the need to acknowledge it. "I've eaten worse." She didn't elaborate on when or where. He wanted to ask. He didn't. After she went back to her room, he sat on the porch in the cold and smoked half a cigarette and stared at the mountains going dark against the sky. And he thought about what his brother Thomas had said when he'd told him about the advertisement. "You're going to end up with someone strange, Sawyer. You can't advertise for a wife like she's a new fence post." Thomas had not been wrong, necessarily. Evelyn Hart was strange. Strange in the way a person was strange when they'd spent a long time being careful, when every word out of their mouth had been measured before it left. He recognized it because he'd done some of that himself. He didn't sleep well that first night. Neither did she. He heard her moving around in the east room well past midnight, the low sounds of drawers opening, of something solid being placed on a shelf, of pages turning. It was 3 days before he found out. Or rather, 3 days before she told him, because Sawyer had noticed the smell the morning of the second day, the faint, sharp bite of something medicinal underneath the wood smoke and cold air, and had filed it away in the back of his mind without putting a name to it. On the third morning, he came in from the barn to find her in the narrow storage room at the back of the house. The room that had been home to broken harnesses, spare lumber, and 3 years of things Sawyer had put down and meant to deal with later. He'd cleared it out before she arrived because he'd thought she might want the space for something. She had something. She had moved everything. The spare lumber was stacked against the outside wall. A plank had been mounted between 2 sawhorses to make a long, flat work surface. On it, laid out with the kind of precise care that reminded him of the way he handled a good rifle, were instruments. Steel instruments, dark-handled, some of them things he could name and some of them he couldn't. Beside them, brown glass bottles, linen bandages rolled tight, a leather case open to show rows of glass-stoppered vials. And books. 6 of them, thick as bricks. Their spines reading words like clinical surgery and principles of medicine, and one simply titled Gray's Anatomy with a heaviness to the binding that said it had been consulted often. Evelyn stood in the middle of it with her back to him, writing something in a small notebook. She heard him stop in the doorway. She turned around. Her chin came up a fraction. Not defiant, exactly. Prepared. "I should have told you before I arrived," she said. Sawyer looked at the room, looked at her. "You're a doctor." "I'm a trained physician." A pause. "Women aren't licensed to practice medicine in most states, but I am trained." He didn't say anything right away. He took in the instruments again, the quiet order of them, the deliberate way they'd been laid out. Not like someone hiding something, but like someone who needed to know where everything was at 3 a.m. "Where'd you train?" he asked. She hadn't expected that question. He saw it in the brief flicker that crossed her face before she answered. "Philadelphia, Women's Medical College. 7 years, including my residency." 7 years. He looked at the anatomy book. "And you came here." "I came here," she agreed, giving him nothing more. He stood there another moment. The mountains were visible through the single window she'd cleaned. He could see the first snow sitting on the high ridgelines like a warning. "The Hollis boy broke 2 ribs last spring," Sawyer said. "Thrown by a horse. The nearest doctor is 42 miles. He rode out there himself. Made it worse." Evelyn was very still. "The Hendersons lost a baby in July. Mrs. Henderson nearly went with it. Old Pruitt did what he could, but he's a barber." He looked at her. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," she said quietly. "So." He stepped back from the doorway. "It's your room. Do what you need." The first real test came 8 days into her time at the ranch, and it came without warning, the way the bad things always did. It was a Tuesday. Sawyer was out mending fence on the north pasture with his 2 ranch hands. Miguel Reyes, who'd been with him 6 years and was as solid a man as Sawyer had ever known, and Pete Dalloway, who was 19 and enthusiastic in a way that occasionally substituted for good judgment. It was Pete who caught the wire wrong. He'd been holding a section of barbed wire, new wire brought in from Billings, the kind with sharp points at regular intervals that ranchers were starting to use for the cattle, and he'd gotten impatient trying to feed it through a post, and the wire had snapped back and caught him across the palm and the inside of the wrist with 3 separate barbs. Pete said a word that Sawyer chose not to repeat. The wounds weren't deep, but they were ragged, and the bleeding was real, and the barb on the wrist had caught something that made the blood pulse rather than flow, which was the detail that made Sawyer's stomach go tight. They got him back to the ranch in the wagon, with Pete holding his arm up and Miguel keeping pressure on the wrist with a folded cloth that was soaked through by the time they reached the porch. Sawyer opened the door and called Evelyn's name before he'd fully decided what he was going to say next. She was there in seconds. She took one look at Pete's wrist, said, "Bring him in here," in a voice that left no room for argument, and moved back into the storage room. Her clinic, though they hadn't called it that yet, with a brisk certainty that Sawyer would later struggle to describe properly. She had Pete sitting on the chair she'd placed there, his arm flat on the plank surface, before he'd had time to be scared. She'd already uncorked one of the glass vials. "This will sting," she told him. "It already stings," Pete said. "More than that." She poured it clean. Pete hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "Hold still. What's your name?" "Pete Dalloway, ma'am." "How old are you, Pete?" 19. "Good. You're going to keep all your fingers." She said it like it was already decided, and Pete visibly relaxed. "The barb on your wrist caught the cephalic vein. It's not arterial. If it were arterial, you'd know it, and I'd be moving faster. You're going to need 3 stitches here. Do you want something for the pain?" Pete looked at Sawyer, which Sawyer found obscurely funny at the time. "Take the something," Sawyer said. She stitched him clean. 7 stitches total. 3 on the wrist, 4 across the palm. She worked quickly and without fuss, talking to Pete the whole time in a low, level voice, asking about his family, where he was from, how long he'd worked the Callahan Ranch. And Sawyer understood that it wasn't small talk. It was strategy, keeping the boy's attention someplace other than the needle. When it was done, she wrapped the hand in clean linen and told Pete to keep it dry for 5 days and come back if there was any red streaking up the arm. "Red streaking means infection," she said, looking at Sawyer as much as Pete, making sure somebody responsible was hearing this. "If you see it, don't wait. Come immediately." Pete stood up looking vaguely stunned, the way people looked after something bad had happened and then been resolved faster than expected. "What do I owe you, ma'am?" he asked. Evelyn looked genuinely caught off guard by the question. "Nothing," she said after a pause. "Not yet." That night, after Pete and Miguel had gone to the bunkhouse, Sawyer sat at the kitchen table and Evelyn poured them both a cup of coffee. She had taken over the coffee, which was the first thing she'd done in the kitchen and the first thing she'd done that Sawyer was unambiguously grateful for. And they sat across from each other while the stove ticked and the wind came down from the mountains outside. "You were good with him," Sawyer said. "He was a cooperative patient. They're not all like that." "No," he agreed. He turned the cup in his hands. "You've done that a lot, the talking while you work. It helps. The body, when people are in pain and frightened, the body holds on to the pain harder. Give the mind something else to chase, and the hands can do their work." He nodded slowly. Outside, something moved in the dark, probably a coyote, pushing along the tree line the way they did in the cold. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up from her cup. "I'm not going to ask you questions you don't want to answer." He said it straight, not gentle, because she didn't seem like a person who did well with gentle. "But I'll tell you this. Whatever it is you came away from, I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking. Whatever it is, it's not going to follow you here without me knowing about it." The words surprised him as he said them. He hadn't planned to say them. She was very quiet for a moment. "You don't know that," she said finally. "No," he admitted, "but I mean it anyway." She studied him the way she'd studied Pete's wrist that afternoon, clinically, precisely, looking for the thing under the surface. Then she looked back down at her coffee. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't leave the table either. They sat there another 20 minutes in a silence that was, for the first time since she'd arrived, something close to comfortable. The first real snow came 2 weeks later. It came fast and mean, the way Montana snow did, arriving in the night and burying the world by morning. Sawyer woke at 4 to the silence that told him everything was white, and he went out to check the cattle with a lantern and came back to find Evelyn already in the kitchen with the stove going and something on the fire that smelled nothing like salt pork. "You don't have to do that," he said, shaking snow from his hat. "I know I don't." She was cracking eggs into a cast-iron pan with the unselfconscious efficiency of someone who'd fed herself for years. "Sit down." He sat down. She put eggs in front of him and fresh biscuits that she'd made from scratch in the time it had taken him to check the herd, and he ate them and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound ridiculous. In the weeks since Pete Dalloway's stitches, things had shifted between them in a way Sawyer couldn't have easily named. She was careful still. Careful the way a person was careful when they'd learned that ease cost things. But there were moments of something. She would sometimes laugh at something Miguel said. A quick surprise sound like the laugh had gotten out before she'd thought about it. She had started asking questions about the ranch, real questions, not polite ones, about the cattle breeds, about the winter grazing patterns, about the well's depth and the reliability of the spring. She was learning the place. She was learning it like she meant to stay. He noticed. The snow kept falling. 3 days in, the Henderson family showed up at the door. Jacob Henderson, his wife Clara, and their 4-year-old daughter Mary, who had a fever that had been running for 2 days and had crept high enough that Clara's face showed the flat, controlled terror of a mother who'd already lost one child and wasn't sure she could survive losing another. Evelyn had Mary in this east room, the clinic room, within 2 minutes. She was in there for an hour, while Sawyer sat with Jacob Henderson at the kitchen table and tried to make conversation, and mostly just poured the man coffee and let him stare at his hands. When Evelyn came out, she was still wiping her hands on a cloth, and Clara was behind her holding Mary, who was asleep on her mother's shoulder, color already better. "Scarlet fever," Evelyn said to Jacob, quietly but directly. "Early stage. I've given her something to bring the fever down, and I'll need you to come back in 3 days. Keep her warm and make sure she drinks." She looked at Clara. "You did the right thing coming." Clara Henderson sat down in the kitchen chair and started crying without making any sound, which was the kind of crying that came from relief so intense it had nowhere else to go. Evelyn stood there a moment, then she put her hand briefly on the woman's shoulder. An awkward gesture, unpracticed, like she wasn't entirely sure it was the right thing. And then she stepped back and told Jacob the route to take home through the snow to avoid the worst drifts. Later, after the Hendersons had gone, Sawyer found Evelyn in the clinic room putting things back in their places with the careful deliberateness she always used, and he stood in the doorway again the way he had that first time. "You knew," he said. "You knew what she had before you went in." She glanced back at him. "The rash on her neck, the color, the kind of fever. Yes, I had a reasonable idea. But you took the hour anyway." "I took the hour to make sure." He looked at her. This woman who had arrived 23 days ago in a stagecoach with heavy bags and a story she wasn't telling. And he had the sudden inconvenient thought that he had not thought about being lonely in 3 weeks. He went back to the kitchen. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words yet. On the last day of November, a letter arrived. It came with the mail rider, a boy named Cole, who made the circuit from Billings twice a month and always looked half frozen when he rode up. Sawyer paid him and sorted through the bundle: ranch business, a note from Thomas, a supply catalog, and at the bottom was a cream-colored envelope addressed to Miss Evelyn Hart, in handwriting that Sawyer registered and moved past, and then stopped and looked at again. The handwriting was heavy. The letters were made with a lot of pressure, the kind of writing that left grooves in the paper. The postmark was Boston. He brought the bundle inside and left it on the table and said nothing. He was out in the barn when he heard her. Not a scream. Evelyn Hart didn't scream. It was something quieter and worse, a single sharp intake of breath that cut through the cold all the way from the house to the barn. And Sawyer set down what he was holding and walked back to the house with a steadiness in his step that was mostly performance. She was at the kitchen table with the letter open in her hands. She wasn't crying. Her face was set in a way that Sawyer was starting to recognize. The face she made when she was deciding something, when she was running calculations behind her eyes that he wasn't privy to. "Evelyn?" She looked up. Her hands were not shaking, but they were holding the letter too tight. He could see the white at her knuckles. "I need you to know something," she said. He sat down across from her, the same chairs they always used, the ones that had gotten to be theirs without discussion. "All right," he said. She folded the letter and set it flat on the table between them, and she told him. Not everything. He understood later that there was more than she said that first time, that the full accounting came in pieces over the following weeks, the way truth always came from people who'd learned that trust was a thing earned in installments. But enough. Enough that by the time she stopped talking and the kitchen had gone quiet except for the wind in the stove, Sawyer understood the shape of it. A man in Boston. Wealthy. Connected. Victor Ashcroft, she said, and the name sat between them like something with weight. She had worked in his household years ago, in the years before she'd finished her training. She had trusted him in the early days before she'd understood what kind of man he was. He'd used what he knew about her training, her aspirations, as leverage. When she'd finally left, she'd taken with her the one thing he couldn't replace, the proof of what he'd done. Documents, records, the kind that could ruin him. He'd been looking for her since. The letter apparently was his way of letting her know he'd found her. Sawyer sat with it a moment. "The letter," he said. "What does it say exactly?" She looked at him. "It says," she said carefully, "that he hopes Montana is treating me well, that he thinks of me often, that he expects to be traveling west in the spring on business." The way she said business made the word something other than what it was. "He's not coming to visit," Sawyer said. "No," she said. "He's not." He looked out the window at the mountains, gray and white against a gray sky, the snow still deep on the ground, the road to town invisible under it. He thought about Thomas's voice saying, "You're going to end up with someone strange." He thought about Pete Dalloway's stitched wrist and Mary Henderson's fever breaking and the way Evelyn had stood in the lamplight in this kitchen 23 days ago, holding that bag across her chest like it was the only thing she'd brought out of her whole previous life. "Spring," he said. That's what he said. Sawyer nodded once, looked back at her. "Then we have time," he said, "to figure it out." She watched him for a long moment. The lantern between them threw uneven light across the table, across the letter, across both their faces. "You should know," she said quietly, "that if he comes, he won't come alone. He never does anything alone." "I know people too," Sawyer said. She almost said something. He could see her considering it, weighing it, deciding how much to give. In the end, she just said, "All right, Sawyer." Outside, the Montana wind pushed against the house, testing the walls, finding them solid. It would be a long winter, but they would not face the spring alone. The winter settled in hard that year, the kind of hard that made men philosophical about their choices and cattle ornery about everything. Snow came down off the mountains in waves, each one deeper than the last, and by the second week of December, the road to Harrow Creek was more suggestion than fact. Sawyer had lived through 11 Montana winters. He knew the rhythms, the way the cold got into the wood of the house and made it talk at night, the way the horses stood with their backs to the wind in the near pasture, the way the hours between 4 in the morning and full light stretched out long and silent and asked a man questions he wasn't always ready to answer. This winter was different, and it wasn't the weather. He told himself in the days after Evelyn's letter that nothing had changed. He'd gone about his work, the cattle, the fences, the twice-daily checks on the water troughs to break the ice before the herd went thirsty, with the same deliberateness he'd always brought to everything. But Victor Ashcroft's name sat somewhere in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't reach, and he found himself doing small things differently, checking the lock on the front door before he slept, taking note of who came down the road, keeping his rifle closer than usual. He didn't mention it to Evelyn. She didn't mention it to him. They were two people who'd both learned at some point in their lives that talking about the thing you were afraid of gave it more room to grow. What they talked about instead was everything else. It happened gradually, the way most things happened that actually mattered. It started with questions about the ranch. She asked them, he answered them, and somehow an answer about the spring grazing rotation turned into a conversation about the summer he'd spent 3 weeks tracking down 30 head of stolen cattle, and that turned into her telling him about the winter. She'd been a third-year student, and the teaching hospital had lost its funding, and all the students had kept working anyway, sleeping 4 hours a night and eating what the kitchen staff left out, because the patients were there whether the money was or not. "You weren't angry?" he asked. "At the situation?" "I was furious," she said, without hesitation. "I was furious the whole time. I just didn't see the point in stopping." He'd looked at her over his coffee cup and thought that he understood something about her that he hadn't understood before. By January, the clinic room had expanded its reach without the room itself getting any larger. Word had traveled. That was the thing about frontier communities. Word traveled like water found its level, following every available path. And people had started coming, not in a flood. Quietly, the way people came when they weren't entirely sure they were doing the right thing, but the alternative was worse. A farmer named Garrett Foss came first, on behalf of his wife, who'd had a persistent cough since October that had never quite left. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and told Sawyer he'd heard the new Mrs. Callahan had some medical training, and he said it in the careful way of a man who wasn't sure how to ask for something he'd been taught not to need. Sawyer brought him inside. Evelyn spent 40 minutes with Ellen Foss 2 days later, when Garrett brought her in wrapped in 2 coats and still looking cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She came out of the clinic room and told Garrett that his wife had a lung infection that she'd been working around for months, that she'd been managing the symptoms on her own without saying anything, and that if they'd waited another month it would have settled deep enough to do real damage. Garrett Foss was a tall, weathered man who'd been farming this land for 15 years and had survived things that would have broken other people. He stood in Sawyer's kitchen and pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose for a moment before he looked up. "What do we do?" he asked. Evelyn told him. Medicines, rest, instructions that she wrote down in clear, plain language because she'd already figured out that written instructions went home with people and got followed, while spoken ones got muddled by the time the wagon reached the road. She did not charge him. When he insisted on leaving something, he'd brought a cured ham from the smokehouse, set it on the porch without asking. She let him because she understood that people needed to give something back, that it was about dignity as much as payment. After he left, she stood in the kitchen doorway with the list she'd been making, supplies she needed, things she was running low on, and she said to Sawyer, without looking up from the paper, "I need more of the willow bark extract and the catgut sutures. I'm down to my last package." "I'll add it to the order," he said. "What else?" She looked up then. The question had been practical, but something in it had landed differently. "Laudanum," she said, "carefully controlled. I don't like using it, but for the serious pain, I need it available." "All right." "Sawyer." She hesitated, a fraction of a pause barely there. "This is going to cost you. The supplies. I want you to know I'm aware of that, and when the spring comes, It's fine," he said. "I'm not asking you to fund this indefinitely." "Evelyn." He said her name in the flat way he said things when he'd already decided them. "We have money for it. Order what you need." She looked at him another moment, then wrote it down on her list. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. The weeks pressed on. Miguel Reyes came down with a fever in late January that had Sawyer genuinely worried for 3 days, and Evelyn sat with him in the bunkhouse each morning and evening, checking, adjusting, telling him in broken but serviceable Spanish that was better than Sawyer had expected that he needed to stay in bed, which Miguel mostly did, except for the one morning he tried to get up and check on a heifer he was worried about, and Evelyn appeared in the bunkhouse doorway like she'd heard it from the house somehow and sent him back to his cot with a look that made the big man sit down without argument. "How did you know he'd gotten up?" Sawyer asked her later. "I didn't," she said. "I came to check on him. I come every morning." "Before the barn," he said, realizing. "You're out before I go to the barn." She shrugged, which was as close as she came to saying yes, obviously. Miguel recovered. He brought her a carved wooden figure he'd made during his bunk rest, a small horse, detailed enough to show he had real skill with a knife, and set it on her clinic shelf without ceremony. It stayed there. Sawyer noticed. February brought a boy who'd taken an axe glancing off a log and caught his own shin, a woman from the Dalton homestead 7 miles east with the difficult pregnancy that Evelyn monitored twice a week through the last 2 months, and an elderly man named Hector Pruitt, the barber Sawyer had mentioned that first day. who came ostensibly to ask Evelyn a professional question and stayed for 2 hours, the two of them talking medicine in a low, animated way while Sawyer sat in the kitchen and listened to the rise and fall of the conversation and felt something settle in the house that hadn't been there before. She was real here. She was real in a way she hadn't quite been yet. He wasn't sure he could have explained the difference, but he felt it. There was an afternoon in late February. The light was different that day, the particular gray gold of winter almost over, when Evelyn came in from a visit to the Dalton homestead, and she was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that sat in her bones. And she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands and said nothing. Sawyer had just come in from the barn. He stood in the doorway reading the room. He'd gotten better at that. He got 2 cups, poured coffee, sat down. She lifted her head and looked at the cup and then at him. "The baby's positioned wrong," she said. "Mrs. Dalton's. I've tried to turn it twice. She's due in 6 weeks." A pause. "In a real hospital, with the right instruments, there are things I could do. Out here, I have what I have." "Which is considerable," he said. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You've gotten optimistic." "I watched you stitch Pete Dalloway's wrist in 12 minutes and talk him through it so he barely knew it was happening," Sawyer said. "That's not nothing. That was stitches." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "This is different. What do you need?" "Time," she said, "and for her to eat better, which I've told her, which her husband has told her, and which she nods at and then does what she wants." A flicker of something. It might have been dark humor. "She reminds me of someone." "Who?" Evelyn looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You, a little." He blinked. Then something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. "I eat fine." "You eat the same 5 things in rotation, and you'd have eaten nothing but salt pork and bad beans since October if I hadn't intervened." "The beans aren't that bad." "Sawyer, the beans are terrible." He looked at her. She looked at him. The kitchen was warm, and the coffee was real, and outside the last of the afternoon light was going gold along the snow, and they were sitting across from each other the way they always did, the way it had become simply what the end of a day looked like. And he thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than he'd thought it before, that he didn't know what he'd been thinking, that last line in his own advertisement. Not romance, partnership. As though the two things were so different. As though a man could spend a winter watching a woman work and talk and argue and care and not end up somewhere he hadn't planned to be. He didn't say any of this. He drank his coffee. But the thought stayed with him through the evening and well into the night, honest and inconvenient, lodged somewhere it wasn't coming out. The traveler came on the first real thaw day of March. He came from the east, which Sawyer noted, on a gray horse that had been ridden hard and not recently rested. He was maybe 50, weathered and lean with the kind of road-worn look that said he'd been moving fast and the road had not been cooperative. He came up to the ranch house in the late afternoon and called out from the gate the way a careful man would, making sure he was seen and heard before he got close. His name was Thomas Briggs. He said he was a freight courier out of Billings, and maybe he was. But the way he checked the road behind him twice in the first 5 minutes told Sawyer that, whatever else he was a man who'd gotten used to watching his back. Evelyn brought out coffee, and Briggs sat on the porch, and he told them what he'd heard in Billings, where he'd been 3 days ago, which was where he'd picked up the word. Victor Ashcroft had been in Billings, not passing through. He'd been there 2 days, asking questions, the kind of questions that required money to get answered, and Ashcroft apparently had money to burn. He was traveling with 4 men, and the 4 men were not business associates in any recognizable sense of the word. Briggs had seen 2 of them outside the hotel, and he described them in plain terms, armed, watching the street, not there for the scenery. He'd heard the name Callahan Ranch come up. He'd heard the name Evelyn. Then he'd gotten on his horse. "I'm not in your business," Briggs said to Sawyer, turning his cup in his hands. "And I'm not in hers. I just thought someone should know." The porch was quiet. Somewhere in the near pasture a horse snorted and shifted. Sawyer looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the road east. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was deciding something, the controlled stillness she wore like armor. But underneath it, if you knew to look, and Sawyer had gotten to know, There was something he'd never seen on her before. Not fear, exactly. More like the moment before fear, the intake of breath before the cold hit. Ashcroft was 3 days behind. Maybe less, if he'd kept moving. Briggs finished his coffee, refused supper, and got back on his horse with the manner of a man who delivered what he had and wanted to be a good distance from the consequences. Sawyer watched him go down the road and then turned back to the house. Evelyn was still standing on the porch. "Say it," she said, without turning around. He came up beside her and leaned on the porch rail. The thaw had made everything wet and dark. The mountains were clear for the first time in weeks, the snow line sharp against a pale sky. "You know what I'm going to say," he told her. "That I should leave. Go further west. Denver, maybe. Or Oregon." Her voice was flat. "That I knew this was coming, and I don't have the right to pull you into it." He was quiet for a moment. "That last part isn't what I was going to say." She turned to look at him. "I was going to say we need to tell people," Sawyer said. "Not to run, to tell them." She stared at him. "Tell who? Foss? Henderson? Old Pruitt? The Daltons?" He looked back at the road, now empty. The dust settled. "Pete and Miguel." He paused. "Thomas, my brother. He's got 3 hands working for him, and they're all capable men." "Sawyer, You saved Ellen Foss's lungs," he said, still not looking at her. "You're keeping Rebecca Dalton's baby alive. You kept Miguel on his feet in time for winter roundup." He turned to her then, straight on. "You think those people are going to sit in their houses when a man from Boston rides in with hired guns to drag you out of the territory?" Evelyn looked at him for a long time. The light was fading. The mountains went from pale gold to gray. "He has money," she said quietly. "He'll tell people things. He'll make it look legal. Let him try." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Sawyer said. "I didn't say it was simple. I said we're not running." Something shifted in her face. Not relief. It was more complicated than relief, laced through with something that was almost anger, the way a person looked when someone said the thing they'd wanted to believe but hadn't let themselves. "Why?" she asked. Her voice had gone quiet, stripped of the controlled precision she usually kept around it. "Why does this matter to you? This was supposed to be a practical arrangement. That's what you wrote. That's what we agreed to." He looked at her. "Things change," he said. She held his gaze. The wind came down off the mountains, the cold edge still in it, even with the thaw. She didn't argue. She didn't say yes either, not in words. But she turned back toward the house and she said, "You should get word to your brother tonight." Sawyer pushed off the rail and followed her in. The next morning he rode to town. He rode to the Foss farm. He stopped at Henderson's on the way back. He sent a letter with Cole, the mail rider, to Thomas, who was 60 miles north, and he wrote it short and plain in the way his brother would understand. "Company coming, the bad kind. Could use you." He didn't beg. Thomas wouldn't have wanted him to. What he didn't tell Evelyn, not that day, was that he'd gone to see Sheriff Walt Greer in Harrow Creek, a man who was more useful than the badge sometimes implied, and had a quiet conversation in the back of the sheriff's office that ended with Greer leaning back in his chair and saying, "This Ashcroft, he got paper on her, legal paper?" "I don't know yet," Sawyer said. "Find out," Greer said, "because if he's got paper, it complicates things. And if he doesn't," he smiled, and it wasn't a warm smile exactly, but it had a certain satisfaction in it, "then he's just a man from Boston, on my land trying to take something that isn't his." Sawyer rode home in the last light with the cold still in the air and the mud of the thaw under the horse's hooves and the mountains standing up against the fading sky like they'd been standing there forever and didn't particularly care what happened at their feet. But he cared. He unsaddled the horse and came in through the back and found Evelyn in the clinic room, not working, just standing there looking at everything she'd built. The instruments, the shelves, the anatomy book with its worn binding, the little carved horse Miguel had made. And her back was to him, but he could see the line of her shoulders, the held tension in them, the shape of a woman facing something she'd been running from for years, and finally deciding maybe that she was done running. He didn't interrupt it. He went to the kitchen and started the stove and put on the coffee, badly, the way he always did, and after a while he heard her come down the hall. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her. "The Dalton baby turned this morning," she said, in a voice that was trying to be casual. Felt it shift on my way back. Right position. A pause, and then, "That's something, at least." "That's a lot," he said. She looked at her hands. "I'm not going to leave," she said, quiet but definite. "I want you to know that I've decided. Not because I don't have anywhere to go. Because I don't want to go." He nodded. "And if it goes badly, it won't," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, same as he'd said it back in November. "But I mean it anyway." The stove ticked. The coffee came up slow. The night settled around the ranch the way night did. Complete, close, everything beyond the lamplight gone to dark. And they sat with it, with all of it, the waiting and the worry and the warmth of the kitchen and the fact that whatever was coming down that road from the east, they would meet it here. Together. Neither of them said that word. They didn't need to. Thomas Callahan arrived 4 days after the letter, which meant he'd saddled up within an hour of receiving it. He rode in with two of his hands, a quiet Scotsman named Ewan McCready, who shot with the kind of unhurried accuracy that made other men nervous, and a younger man called Dix, who had a broken nose that had healed wrong and the disposition of someone who'd stopped being surprised by trouble a long time ago. Thomas himself was 2 years older than Sawyer, broader through the shoulders, with the same dark eyes but more lines around them and a laugh that came easier. He'd always been the one people warmed to first. Sawyer was the one they trusted later. He came through the door, took one look at Evelyn, and said, "So you're the doctor." "I'm his wife," Evelyn said from the stove, not turning around. "Are those mutually exclusive out here?" She turned around then, spatula in hand, and looked at him with the measuring expression Sawyer had come to recognize. Thomas met it straight on, and something passed between them. Some quick, invisible assessment. And Thomas apparently passed, because she turned back to the stove. "Sit down," she said. "There's enough for everyone." Thomas sat. He caught Sawyer's eye across the table and gave him a look that said several things at once without saying any of them out loud. Sawyer ignored it. That evening, with supper done and the hands settled in the bunkhouse, the three of them sat at the kitchen table with a map of the property spread out between the coffee cups. Sawyer had drawn it himself, rough but accurate, the kind of map made by a man who'd walked every foot of the land in every season. The house at the center, the two barns east and west, the long approach road from the south, the tree line north, and the creek running diagonal behind the east barn. Thomas studied it. "He'll come down the road," he said. "He's not a man who knows the back ways." "He has men who might," Sawyer said. "How many?" Briggs said 4. Could be more now. Thomas nodded slowly. "The tree line's a problem. If any of them come around through the north pasture—" "I know," Sawyer said. "I can put Ewan up there," Thomas said. "He doesn't need to be told twice about anything. He'll need a place out of the cold. It's still freezing at night." "Ewan's fine. He grew up in Aberdeen. This is summer to him." Evelyn had been listening without speaking, one hand wrapped around her cup, the map spread out in front of her. Now she said, "Victor won't want to fight. Not openly." She set it to the table, then looked up. "He wants to take me quietly, legally, with paperwork that looks legitimate, a scene, gunfire, bodies. That's a problem for him back east. He has a reputation to protect. So he'll try to make it look clean," Sawyer said. "He'll have a document, something with a seal on it. He'll say I'm mentally unfit, or that I have outstanding debts, or that I stole something from him." Her voice was level, but her jaw was set. "He's done it before. To other people." Thomas looked at her. "And did it work? Before?" A pause. "Once. The woman, she didn't have anyone standing behind her." The table was quiet. "Then we're going to need Walt Greer here," Thomas said to Sawyer. "Already asked him. And we need people." He looked at the map. "Not because we can't handle 4 hired guns. Because when Ashcroft rides up and sees 40 people in the yard, he's going to understand the math before he makes any mistakes." Sawyer nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from Thomas made it real in a different way. The kind of real that meant it was actually going to happen. "I'll ride out tomorrow," he said. "Foss, Henderson, Pruitt. I'll send word to the Daltons, though with Rebecca due." "Jacob Dalton will come," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. His daughter almost died in January. He'll come. She was right. Sawyer knew it before she finished saying it. She stood up from the table and started clearing the cups with the brisk efficiency she used when she was done with a conversation and needed her hands busy. Then she stopped. Her back was still to them. "I need you both to understand something," she said. "When it's over, whatever happens, if anyone is hurt, I will treat them, all of them, including whoever comes with him." She turned around. Her expression was not asking for permission. "That's not negotiable." Thomas looked at Sawyer. Sawyer looked at his wife. "Nobody's arguing with you," Sawyer said. She held his gaze another moment, then nodded and took the cups to the basin. Thomas watched her go and then looked back at Sawyer, and his face had shifted into something quieter. "She's something," he said, low enough that it was just between them. "Yeah," Sawyer said, just the one word. Thomas seemed to find that sufficient. The next 6 days had the quality of a held breath. Sawyer rode. He covered 30 miles in 2 days, stopping at every farm and homestead he could reach, having the same conversation over and over with variations he couldn't always predict. Most of them he'd known for years. He didn't have to explain much. He said there was a man coming from back east with armed men to take his wife by force, and he said his wife was the woman who'd stitched their sons and brought their fevers down and sat with their wives through the bad births, and he watched their faces as the information settled. Garrett Foss said, without hesitation, "When do you need me?" Jacob Dalton said, "I'll be there. Rebecca's going to be furious and she'll understand." Henderson said nothing, just looked out at his barn for a moment and then said, "I'll bring my brother-in-law. He's got a rifle and he doesn't scare easy." Pete Dalloway, when Sawyer got back and told him, looked at his stitched hand. Healed clean, no infection, exactly as Evelyn had said it would be, and said, "Mr. Callahan, you didn't even need to ask." Old Pruitt came on his own, unasked, 3 days before it happened. He rode up in the afternoon with a shotgun across his saddle and a look on his face that suggested he'd heard things and had opinions about them. He tied his horse and came to the porch and said to Evelyn, who'd answered the door, "I've been the only thing between sick folks and dying in this territory for 12 years, and I'm a barber. You changed that. I reckon I owe you something for it." Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at him and then said, "Come inside, the coffee's on." Walt Greer rode in the day before, badge on his chest, a deputy named Hicks who was young but steady, and a calm professional manner that was one of the things Sawyer valued most about the man. He looked at the yard, at the horses tied at the far barn, at the men moving around with rifles, and then he looked at Sawyer. "This is more than I expected," he said. "These are people who wanted to be here," Sawyer said. Greer nodded once. "I need to be the one who speaks first when he comes. That's not negotiable. Whatever he's carrying, documents, warrants, whatever it is, it comes through me. Understood?" "Understood." "And I need to see whatever she's got," Greer said quietly. "The documents she brought. The ones she took from him. Before he gets here, not after." Sawyer had expected this. He went inside and told Evelyn, and she was quiet for a moment, the way she was when she was deciding how much to trust. And then she went to the clinic room and came back with a leather envelope that she'd kept at the bottom of one of her heavy trunks since Boston. She sat with Greer at the kitchen table for an hour. Sawyer stayed but didn't speak. He watched Greer's face as the man read, the careful expressions of a man who'd seen a lot and didn't rattle easily, working through something that rattled him anyway. When Greer closed the envelope, he was quiet for a moment. "He let employees die," Greer said. "It wasn't a question." 3, Evelyn said. "That I can document. The treatment they were denied, so I was the one treating them at first, before he stopped allowing it." She said it flat, the way she said things that cost her to say. "He controlled the medical access for everyone in his household. That included who received care and who didn't. When I started treating people without his permission, the arrangement became difficult. And the record she took," Greer said to himself, looking at the envelope, "would end him, professionally, probably legally." "Yes," Evelyn said. Greer picked up the envelope. "I'll keep this tonight. These are evidence. If he tries anything with paperwork tomorrow, these are the counter-argument." He looked at her. "You did right, taking them." It was a simple statement. Evelyn received it without expression, but Sawyer saw her exhale, a breath she'd been holding for a long time, maybe longer than just today. The night before was the longest one. Sawyer lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house. The bunkhouse full now, with Thomas's men and the Henderson brothers-in-law and Foss and Dalloway and the others, too many men for the space, a low hum of voices and shifted weight. Evelyn was across the hall. He knew she wasn't sleeping any more than he was. He got up at 3 and went to the kitchen and was not surprised to find her already there. She was sitting at the table with nothing in front of her. No coffee, no book, just sitting in the dark the way a person sat when the inside of their head was too loud. He lit the lamp, got the coffee going, sat down. "You scared?" he asked. He wouldn't have asked it a month ago. He would have now. She thought about it, which was something he'd noticed about her, so she didn't give reflex answers. "Yes," she said. Not of him exactly, of what it does to people. When it goes wrong. She looked at the lamp. "I've seen it go wrong." "What happened?" A beat. "A woman in Philadelphia. Her husband came to collect her from the college. She'd enrolled without his knowledge. He had legal standing. She didn't." Evelyn's voice was careful and flat, the way it got when she was speaking around something rather than through it. "We couldn't stop him. We tried." Sawyer sat with that. "That's not this," he said finally. "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at him. In the lamplight, with the dark outside and the house full of sleeping men and the coffee starting to smell right, she looked different than she had on that stagecoach 4 months ago. Not softer, exactly. She'd never been soft, and he wouldn't have wanted her to be. More settled. Like she'd stopped trying to take up less space. "You did this," she said. "All of it. The people in that bunkhouse. You brought them here. They brought themselves," he said. "Because of you." He looked at his coffee cup. "Because of you," he corrected. She was quiet. Then, "Sawyer." He looked up. She didn't say anything for a moment. Whatever she'd been about to say, she turned it over, and what she ended up with was, "I'm glad I came here. I want you to know that. Whatever tomorrow looks like." He held her gaze. "I'm glad you came here too," he said. And then, because this was not the night for careful words and held back things, "You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch. And that's not about the medical practice." She looked at him for a long time. "Don't say things like that when I can't think straight," she said quietly. "I'll say it again when you can," he said. The coffee came up. They drank it. By 5 in the morning, the house was starting to stir, and the moment was over, tucked away into the place where the important things went, and there was no time to be soft about anything, because the day had arrived. Victor Ashcroft came at mid-morning. He came down the road the way Thomas had predicted, straight down the main approach, no attempt at the back ways, because men like Ashcroft didn't come in through back ways. Back ways were for people who weren't sure of their power. Victor Ashcroft had been sure of his power for a long time. There were 5 of them. Not 4, 5. The additional man was large and positioned at the back of the group, and Sawyer clocked him the same moment he saw Ewan McCready up on the north ridge shift his posture almost imperceptibly. Ashcroft himself was not what Sawyer had imagined, and he understood immediately why that was more dangerous than the alternative. He was well dressed for travel. Not a dandy, not theatrical, just expensive in the quiet way that said money old enough to stop proving itself. He was perhaps 55, silver at the temples, with a straight-backed manner on horseback that suggested he'd done it all his life. His face was composed. He looked like a man arriving at a business meeting. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the yard. The yard was full. Sawyer had not tried to arrange them or instruct them on where to stand. They'd come out naturally when the word passed through the bunkhouse that the riders were coming down the road, and they'd arranged themselves the way a community arranged itself without being told, spread out, visible, not threatening in posture, but not retreating either. Foss with his arms crossed, Henderson and his brother-in-law standing at the fence, Pete Dalloway beside Miguel, both of them quiet. Old Pruitt, shotgun resting over his forearm, watching from the porch. Thomas by the barn with Dix, Sheriff Greer at the front, badge catching the cold March sun, and Sawyer standing beside Evelyn on the porch steps. She was not hiding. She had refused to hide, had said so the night before without making a speech of it. She stood straight with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Victor Ashcroft across the yard the way a person looked at something they'd been afraid of for years and were done being afraid of. Ashcroft looked at the yard. He looked at the badge. He looked at Evelyn. Something moved across his face very briefly that was not composure. "Quite a welcome," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to rooms. Greer spoke first, same as he'd said he would. "Victor Ashcroft, I'm Sheriff Walter Greer. I'm going to need you to state your business here before you step 1 foot off that road." Ashcroft looked at the sheriff with polite interest, the way a man looked at something minor. "I'm here on personal business, Sheriff. A private matter between myself and nothing that happens in my territory is a private matter," Greer said. "State your business." A pause. Ashcroft adjusted his reins. "I have documentation authorizing the return of—" "Let me see it," Greer said. One of the hired men, the large one at the back, shifted in his saddle. Ewan McCready, 60 yards north on the ridge, didn't move, but his presence was a weight on the air that the large man seemed to feel, because he stopped shifting. Ashcroft produced a folded document from his coat, and Greer rode forward and took it without hurry and read it. The yard was completely silent except for the horses and the wind. Greer folded the document. He did not hand it back. "This is a civil debt claim," he said, "filed in Massachusetts, signed by a judge I'm not familiar with." He looked at Ashcroft. "It holds no jurisdiction in Montana Territory. I have federal—" "You don't," Greer said, "and you know it. Try the next one." Something shifted in Ashcroft's composure. Not much. A tightening around the eyes. "Evelyn," he said, raising his voice to carry across the yard, looking past the sheriff, "I'm here because I'm concerned. Your family is concerned. You left under difficult—" "I have no family," Evelyn said. Her voice was even, carrying. "Not in Boston. You were not in a stable. I'm a licensed physician," she said. The words landed like something dropped on stone. "I have been treating patients in this community for 4 months. I am a wife, a resident of this territory, and I am telling you, in front of the sheriff of this county, in front of my neighbors, that I will not go anywhere with you. Not today. Not ever." The yard was very still. Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Sawyer beside her. He looked at Greer, who was holding the document with the relaxed patience of a man who had all day. He looked at the yard, at all of it, at the faces of people who had come because they chose to, not because anyone had ordered them here. And he was doing the math that Thomas had predicted, and the math was not coming out in his favor. "This isn't over," Ashcroft said. "Quiet now. Private." The polished surface had thinned. "It is here," Sawyer said. The first words he'd spoken. He said them without raising his voice. He didn't need to. It was one of the hired men who broke it. The large one at the back, the one who'd shifted earlier. He went for something at his belt. Maybe a reflex, maybe a decision. It happened fast enough that the reason got lost in what came after. 3 things happened in roughly the same moment. Ewan McCready fired once from the ridge, a single shot that knocked the man's hat clean off his head without touching him. A deliberate miss that was better than most men's careful aims. Walt Greer had his weapon drawn before the echo reached them, and every man in the yard moved, not toward the riders, but simply forward, a half step, a collective shift of weight that changed the geometry of the situation entirely. The hired man's hand went up and stayed there. Ashcroft did not move. He looked at the man, and then at the ridge, and something went out of his face. Not anger, but calculation. The moment when a man who plays by odds recognizes that the odds have changed. "Get your man in hand," Greer said, very quietly. Ashcroft looked at Greer, looked at the yard, looked at Evelyn one last time, and whatever he was looking for, it was gone, if it had ever been there. She was standing straight and clear-eyed, and not the woman he remembered, not the woman he'd thought he could come collect like a piece of property that had wandered off. He turned his horse. His men followed. They rode back down the road the way they'd come, and no one in the yard spoke until the sound of hooves had faded and the road was empty again, and the wind came back into the silence. And then Garrett Foss said, to no one in particular, "That's that then," in the tone of a man crossing something off a list. Somebody laughed. A ragged, released sound. And then someone else did. and the yard broke open with the noise of a lot of people who'd been holding something tight suddenly letting it go. Evelyn didn't laugh. She stood on the porch steps and watched the empty road and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she'd taught herself to breathe through the things that were hard. Her hands, at her sides, were shaking. She became aware of Sawyer's hand covering hers. Not a dramatic thing, just placed there, warm and real, without ceremony. She didn't pull away. Behind them, Pete Dalloway was shaking Thomas Callahan's hand. Miguel was saying something to Ewan McCready, who had come down from the ridge and was brushing snow from his coat with the satisfied expression of a craftsman who'd done clean work. Old Pruitt had put the safety back on his shotgun and was having a conversation with Walt Greer that seemed to involve a fair amount of hand gesturing. The Henderson brothers-in-law were asking someone about the coffee situation. The sun was up full now over the mountains, cold and clear, the kind of March light that didn't promise warmth yet but was honest about the direction of things. Evelyn looked at all of it. At the people moving in the yard of a ranch she'd arrived at 4 months ago, not knowing a single name. At the little carved horse on her clinic shelf, visible through the window. At the road that was empty now, in the direction that had scared her for years. Her hands had stopped shaking. The days after Ashcroft rode away had a strange quality to them, like the air after a storm. Too clean, too quiet. The kind of stillness that made a person keep checking the sky. Thomas stayed 3 more days. He and Sawyer worked the north fence line together, the way they'd worked things together since they were boys. Mostly in silence, with occasional conversation that covered the practical and occasionally slipped into something more. On the second afternoon, with the mountains clear above them and the mud of the thaw drying out underfoot, Thomas said, without preamble, "You're in love with her." Sawyer kept his hands on the wire. "I know." "Does she know?" "I told her something the night before Ashcroft came." Thomas was quiet for a moment, working a post. "What did she say?" "She told me not to say it when she couldn't think straight." Thomas made a sound that was close to a laugh. "She's got good sense." "She does." "So now that she can think straight, I'm working on it," Sawyer said, in the tone that meant the conversation was done. Thomas let it rest, because he was a man who understood the difference between a closed door and a locked one. When he left on the 3rd morning with Ewan and Dix, he shook Sawyer's hand on the porch and then turned to Evelyn and said, "You ever need anything? Anything at all? You send word to me directly. Not through him. He'll try to handle it himself." "I'm standing right here," Sawyer said. "I know," Thomas said cheerfully, and rode out. Evelyn watched him go with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Then she went back inside because the Dalton baby had arrived 4 days earlier. Healthy, correctly positioned, 8 pounds and loud about it. And Rebecca Dalton was coming in for her follow-up visit, and there was work to do. There was always work to do. That was one of the constants. What changed in the weeks after the confrontation was harder to name than what stayed the same. The clinic room had always been busy. It got busier. Word traveled differently now. Not just the word that there was a woman at the Callahan Ranch with medical training, but something more specific, something that came from people who'd stood in that yard and seen what they'd seen. The story changed shape as it moved through the territory, the way stories did, accumulating details and shedding others, but the core of it stayed intact. A woman from back east had come to Montana with nothing but her skills and her courage, and when a powerful man came to take her away, the whole territory had stood up and said no. People came to her clinic now with a different quality of trust, not more desperate. Desperation had never been the obstacle out here, but more willing. Men who'd ridden 40 miles past discomfort before admitting they needed a doctor came to her at 30. Women who'd been managing their own pain privately brought it into the light. A rancher named Colby from 12 miles west, who'd been telling his wife for 2 years that his chest pains were nothing, arrived on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands and the sheepish expression of a man who'd finally run out of excuses. Evelyn examined him for an hour and came out with a set of instructions that Sawyer overheard from the kitchen. Reduce the salt, no more whiskey in quantity, rest when the pains came instead of pushing through them, come back in a month. "That's it?" Colby asked. He sounded equal parts relieved and disappointed. "That's it for now," Evelyn said. "Follow the instructions and I'll have more to tell you in a month. Don't follow them and I'll have more to tell you considerably sooner." Colby looked at his hat. "My wife's been telling me to come see you since January." "Your wife is a wise woman," Evelyn said. "Tell her I said so." He came back in a month. He'd followed the instructions about 80% of the way, which Evelyn told Sawyer privately was better than average, and she adjusted accordingly and told Colby he was improving without making more of it than it was, because she understood that men like Colby needed results stated plainly without ceremony. In May, the letter arrived from Boston. It was not from Ashcroft. It was from an attorney, a different attorney than the one whose name had appeared on the debt claim document, and its contents were professional and measured and told Evelyn, in careful legal language, that Victor Ashcroft was withdrawing all claims and would not be pursuing the matter further through any court in any jurisdiction. The attorney's name was Harriet Coles, and the letter had a quality to it that suggested Ms. Coles had some personal satisfaction in delivering this particular news. Evelyn read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and said nothing for a moment. Sawyer, across from her, waited. "Walt Greer," she said finally. "He sent the documents." "He told me he was going to," Sawyer said, "back in March, after Ashcroft left. He said he had connections in the federal circuit." She looked up. "You knew?" "I knew he was trying. I didn't know if it would work." She looked at the letter again. She picked it up, read it a third time, and then folded it carefully and held it flat between her palms on the table, and she sat with whatever that felt like for a while, and Sawyer sat with her. "It's over," she said. Not a question. Testing the weight of the words. "Looks like," he said. She set the letter down. She looked out the window at the May morning, green coming into the hills now, the long brown of winter breaking up, the near pasture with the mares who'd foaled in April moving slow and heavy in the new grass. "I need to go see Walt Greer," she said. "I should thank him." "He'll say it was just his job," Sawyer said. "I'll thank him anyway." She started to get up and then stopped. She looked at him across the table in the particular way she'd been looking at him since the night before the confrontation, since the things that had been said at 3 a.m. over coffee, the things that had been set aside but not forgotten. "Sawyer," she said. "Yeah." "You said you'd repeat it," she said, carefully, like a person who'd decided to say the thing they'd been not saying. "When I could think straight." He looked at her. The morning light came through the window and laid across the table between them, and the kitchen smelled like coffee, and outside the foaling mares moved in the new grass. "You're the best thing that's happened to me," he said. "Not the ranch. Me." She held his gaze. Her jaw worked slightly, the way it did when she was holding something back that wanted to come forward. "I'm not easy," she said. "I noticed. I'm stubborn, I overwork, I'll argue with you about medical decisions, and I'll usually be right. And I have years' worth of habits from taking care of everything myself that are going to be slow to change and—" "Evelyn," he said it simply, "I know who you are." She stopped. "I've known since about January," he said. "I'm not surprised by any of it." She looked at him for a long moment in the way she'd looked at him that very first day on the road from the stagecoach, measuring, deciding. Then she said, quiet but clear, "I love you. I want you to know that I know what it means when I say it. I don't say things I don't mean." "I know you don't," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. It was not a romantic moment in the way that stories made moments romantic. She had ink on her left hand from her morning notes, and he hadn't shaved since Tuesday, and the coffee had gone cold, and neither of them moved dramatically toward the other. They just sat there with it, with what had been true for months finally said out loud in the plain light of a May morning, and it was better than dramatic because it was real. He reached across the table. She met him halfway. The summer that followed was the hardest and the best. Hard because the territory did not stop having problems, simply because Sawyer and Evelyn had sorted their personal ones. A late frost killed a third of the Foss wheat crop, and Garrett Foss spent 3 weeks moving between fury and despair before he steadied out. A fever swept through the children of 2 neighboring homesteads in July. Not scarlet fever, something different. And Evelyn worked 6 days straight tracking the pattern of it, isolating the source to a contaminated water cistern shared between the 2 properties, quarantining the sick children and treating them and sitting with 2 of them through nights that could have gone either way and didn't, which cost her a weight she carried quietly for a while after. Hard because in August, the first legal challenge arrived. It came in the form of a letter not from Ashcroft but from the Montana Territorial Medical Association, a body that, Evelyn told Sawyer with the particular dry tone she used for things that irritated her, had only recently been formed and was already primarily interested in who it could exclude. The letter stated that she was practicing medicine without a license recognized by the territory, that she was a woman operating outside the appropriate boundaries of her sex in a professional capacity, and that if she continued, she could face formal censure and possibly prosecution. Sawyer read it over her shoulder, his jaw set in the way it did when he was deciding something. "Who sent this?" he said. "The association," she said. "Who's on the association?" She turned the letter over. 3 names at the bottom, the committee that had drafted it. She read them. "I don't know these men. I know one of them," Sawyer said, "Harlan Briggs. He's a physician in Billings. He came through here. 2 years before you arrived, there was talk about him setting up a regional practice. He wanted to charge a retainer to every family in a 40-mile radius." "Let me guess," Evelyn said. "Nobody paid it," Sawyer said. "They couldn't afford it." She set the letter on the table. "He's not the reason for this. He's just the mechanism." "Does it matter what the reason is? It matters for what we do about it." She picked the letter up again. "This isn't Ashcroft. This is different. This is about making it look legitimate." Sawyer sat down. "Tell me what you need." What she needed, it turned out, was documentation. She had her diplomas from the Women's Medical College. She'd had the presence of mind, when she left Boston, to take them along with the incriminating documents, because she'd understood even then that her credentials were as much a target as anything else. She had patient records, careful, thorough, the kind of records kept by someone who'd learned that documentation was protection. She had, by August, 7 months of practice in the territory, and enough patients whose lives had measurably improved that the evidence was not going to be a problem. What she needed was someone to present it. She wrote a letter to Harriet Coles in Boston. Harriet Coles arrived in Harrow Creek 6 weeks later, which was faster than either of them had expected, on a train to Billings and then a stage to town, carrying a leather case that had the same quality as Evelyn's, heavy with purpose. She was 42, compact, sharp-eyed, with the manner of a woman who'd spent 20 years in rooms where people underestimated her and had learned to use it. She shook Evelyn's hand on the porch and said, "Your case is stronger than you think." "You've looked at it already?" Evelyn asked. "I've been looking at it since March," Coles said. "When Walt Greer sent me the Ashcroft documents, I thought, this woman is going to need a lawyer eventually. I started preparing." She glanced at Sawyer. "You must be the husband." "Sawyer Callahan," he said. "Good," she said, with a briskness that suggested she'd heard enough to form an opinion, and the opinion was favorable. "I'll need a desk in 2 days. Then we'll talk about what comes next." What came next was a formal complaint filed before the territorial governor's office, supported by signed statements from 31 patients, 31 people who wrote in their own words what Evelyn Hart Callahan had done for them and their families. Garrett Foss wrote about his wife's lungs. Jacob Dalton wrote about his daughter's fever and his son's safe delivery. Rebecca Dalton wrote about her baby. Pete Dalloway wrote about his wrist and the way Evelyn had talked him through the stitching. Miguel Reyes, who wrote in careful and precise English that surprised Sawyer not at all because Miguel was precise about everything he chose to do, wrote about his January fever and about what it meant to be sick and far from his family and to have someone sit with him every morning without being asked. Old Pruitt wrote the longest statement. He wrote 3 pages in a cramped hand that was difficult to read but completely clear in its meaning, and he wrote about what it had been like to be the only thing between sick people and dying for 12 years, to do his best with a barber's training and a few medical books, to lose people he might not have lost if there had been someone qualified beside him. He wrote, near the end of the 3 pages, that Evelyn Hart Callahan was the best thing that had happened to the medical care of this territory in the time he'd been here, and that any organization that tried to remove her from practice was going to have to explain that to him personally. Harriet Coles sent the package to the governor's office with a cover letter that Sawyer read and thought was the most precise piece of controlled anger he'd ever seen put into formal language. The association's case fell apart quietly, the way things fell apart when the evidence was overwhelming and the motivation behind the challenge became difficult to explain in public. Harlan Briggs sent a brief letter in October stating that the matter had been reviewed and that no further action would be taken. Evelyn read that letter at the kitchen table the same way she'd read the one from Ashcroft's attorney, twice, carefully, and then set it down. That's it? Sawyer asked. That's it, she said. No apology. No, she said. Men like that don't apologize. They just stop. She paused. Stopping is enough. He thought she might leave it there, the way she sometimes did with victories, absorbing them quietly and moving on. But she sat for another moment and then she said, I want to do something about the licensing. What do you mean? There's no formal process in the territory for licensing frontier physicians, she said, sitting straighter, the way she sat when she was working through something real. Anyone can call themselves a doctor out here. I had Pruitt. He's competent within his limits, but he's a barber. And there are worse than him passing as physicians in other territories. People die from that. She looked at Sawyer. I want to try to change it. Work with the governor's office. Establish a standard. He looked at his wife across the table, at the set of her jaw and the clarity in her eyes, and the way she sat like a person who'd identified a problem and was already planning the solution. That's going to take years, he said. I know, she said. It's going to mean writing to the Capitol, correspondence, fighting the same kind of men who just tried to shut you down. I know that too, she said. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking for permission. I know you're not, he said. I'm asking what you need from me. She blinked. Something moved in her face. Time, she said finally, and someone to keep the coffee going when I'm working late. I can do that, he said. Fall settled over the ranch with the particular richness of a year that had been hard in ways that had built something. The cattle were healthy. The north pasture fence, rebuilt after the winter, was solid. The clinic room had its own small waiting area now. A bench that Sawyer had built without being asked, placed in the hall, covered with a folded quilt that Ellen Foss had left without explanation one afternoon in September. Evelyn had looked at the bench when she'd found it and said, You built a waiting room. There's usually people waiting, Sawyer said. She'd looked at him in the way she did sometimes, when he did something that caught her sideways. She hadn't said anything else. But the quilt stayed on the bench, and when patients came and waited on it, she brought them coffee, and didn't comment on the bench as if it were a new thing, just as if it had always been there, as if this house had always been the kind of place where people came and were taken care of. On a Saturday in October, with the aspens gone gold on the hillsides and the first real cold coming back into the evenings, Harriet Coles sent a short note from Boston. A medical licensing bill had been proposed in the territorial legislature, citing among other things the case of Evelyn Hart Callahan as evidence of the need for formal recognition of qualified frontier physicians. The note ended, Your name is being used in the right ways now. I thought you should know. Evelyn was in the clinic room when Sawyer brought it to her. She read it standing, the way she read things that mattered, and she was quiet for long enough that he thought she might be counting something in her head. Then she said, I need to write to the governor's office. Tonight? Tomorrow, she said, and looked up. Tonight I want to just sit with it for a while. A beat. With you. He put the letter on her shelf beside the little carved horse. They went to the kitchen. He made the coffee badly, the way he always did. She fixed it, the way she always did. They sat across from each other in the chairs that had become theirs over the course of a year that had started with two strangers measuring each other in silence on a wagon road. The stove ticked. The mountains outside went dark against a sky still holding the last of the day's color. Somewhere in the near pasture, a horse moved slow through the grass. Neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, the kind that had been built piece by piece through a winter of hard weather and honest words, and the daily work of two people learning to trust each other with the things that mattered. Evelyn had her hands wrapped around her cup, the same posture she'd had that first night, but everything else was different. The set of her shoulders, the way she sat in the chair, not perched, not ready to move at a moment's notice, but settled. Home in the word's realist sense. Sawyer, she said. Yeah. I think I'm going to be here a long time, she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight, after everything, she looked like exactly who she was. Not softened or simplified, but clear. Good, he said. Outside, the Montana night came on full and deep, and the ranch sat solid under it, the way things sat that had been built to last. The licensing bill passed in March of 1877. It did not pass easily. Nothing worth having in a legislature ever did. It was argued over. amended, stripped down, rebuilt, and argued over again through the better part of 4 months, and Evelyn made 3 trips to the capital in Helena during that time, each one a 2-day ride each way, each one leaving Sawyer at the ranch running things with Miguel and Pete, and the particular background awareness of a man who'd gotten used to a certain presence in his house and felt its absence like a dropped temperature. She came back from the second trip in February with mud on her boots and a controlled frustration that she kept contained until she was inside with the door closed. And then she said, with considerable feeling, "Harlan Briggs has a cousin in the legislature, and his cousin is on the review committee, and I want you to know that I said nothing inappropriate in that room, but I thought it very loudly." Sawyer handed her a cup of coffee. "What did he do?" "He sat there and smiled at me the way men smile when they're certain they have more time than you do," she said. "He kept asking me to define my training again, as if the diploma was unclear." She sat down and pulled her boots off, and one of them hit the floor with more force than strictly necessary. "He asked me if I'd consulted with a male physician before establishing my practice." "What did you say?" "I said the nearest male physician was 42 miles away, and the nearest patient had been bleeding on my kitchen floor." She drank her coffee. "He wrote something down after that. I don't know what." "Probably something complimentary," Sawyer said. She gave him a look that could have stripped paint, but she went back a third time, in March, and she took with her the stack of patient statements, now 47 of them, because word of the licensing fight had traveled through the territory and people had added their names without being asked. And she sat before the review committee for 3 hours and answered every question they put to her with the precise, unhurried certainty of a woman who had nothing left to prove and knew it. The bill passed 11-4. Harriet Coles sent a telegram this time, not a letter. It arrived at the Harrow Creek Telegraph office on a Thursday afternoon, and Cole, the mail writer, brought it out the next morning, and it said simply, "Bill passed. You are licensed. Briggs voted no. Doesn't matter. H.C." Evelyn read it at the kitchen table, and Sawyer watched her face go through something complicated. Relief and vindication, and something older than both. Something that had to do with the 7 years in Philadelphia and the nights in Boston when she'd understood what she was up against and chosen to keep going anyway. Her eyes were bright. She blinked it back. "License," she said. "Licensed," he confirmed. She set the telegram down flat on the table, same as she'd set the letters before it, the habit of a woman who kept her documents in order. Then she stood up and she walked to the clinic room, her clinic, with the instruments on their shelf and the anatomy book, and the little carved horse, and the growing collection of things patients had left over 2 years, a dried flower from Ellen Foss, a small painted stone from one of the Dalton children, a tin of good tea from a widow named Mrs. Garrett, who'd come in with a broken wrist and stayed to talk for an hour. And she stood in the doorway of it and looked at it. Sawyer came and stood beside her. "It was always real," he said after a moment. "I know," she said, "but now it's real on paper. That matters." She paused. "The paper is what protects the people after me, the women who come next, who want to do this. It's not about me." He understood that. He'd understood it for a while, actually, that the licensing fight had never really been personal for her, even when it felt personal. She was thinking 3 moves ahead in a game that was going to outlast both of them, the way she thought about everything that mattered. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it, which she did now, the way she did things now that she'd stopped negotiating with herself about, naturally, without marking it as a thing being done. Outside, the first real thaw of the second winter was happening, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, the creek running higher and faster than it had in months. The year that followed the licensing was the year things stopped being survival and started being life. It was a meaningful difference, and Sawyer felt it in ways he couldn't always articulate. The ranch had been a place he worked and maintained and kept solvent. It had been a good place, a serious place, but it had been, he understood now, in the way you understood things by contrast, a place where a man kept his head down and moved from task to task and called that living. He'd been doing it so long he'd stopped questioning it. With Evelyn, it became something else. She had opinions about the cattle breeds, strong ones delivered over supper without apology, based on what she'd observed about the winter health of different animals, which she tracked with the same clinical attention she gave her patients. She was right often enough that Sawyer started listening, and then started consulting, And there was a Saturday in June of that year when they spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers and the cattle records and a map of the grazing rotation. And he realized at some point in the middle of it that this was the conversation he'd meant when he'd written partnership in that advertisement, the actual thing, the thing he hadn't known how to want more specifically than that. Miguel noticed. He said nothing about it directly because Miguel was not a man who said things directly when a look would do, but he had a manner in those months that was close to satisfied, the way a person looked when something they'd been watching come together finally did. Pete Dalloway, who had considerably less restraint than Miguel, said to Sawyer one afternoon in the near pasture, with no context and no lead-up, "She's good for you. You used to be kind of grim." "I wasn't grim," Sawyer said. "You were a little grim," Pete said. "Not bad grim, just you worked a lot and you didn't talk much, and sometimes a man would say something funny and you'd take about 4 seconds before you'd react, and by then it was too late." He considered. "You're quicker now." Sawyer thought about arguing with this and then decided it wasn't worth it, because Pete was basically right. He wasn't going to tell him that. The first child came in January of 1878. She arrived ahead of schedule, which seemed appropriate given who her mother was, in the early hours of a Sunday morning during the kind of snowstorm that blankets the world in silence. Evelyn had been managing the final weeks of the pregnancy with the particular quality of controlled irritation she brought to anything that inconvenienced her bodily. She had patients to see, paperwork to file, correspondence with the governor's office about a second licensing proposal she was helping draft, and her own body's increasing insistence on slowing down was treated as an obstacle to be negotiated with. "You are a doctor," Sawyer said in November. "You know what's supposed to happen." "I know exactly what's supposed to happen," she said. "I also know that Mrs. Colby is coming in on Thursday, and she is not going to reschedule again, because last time she rescheduled, she waited 6 weeks, and by then, the thing I was monitoring had gotten worse. I'll see Mrs. Colby," he said. She stopped. "You'll... what?" "I'll tell her you'll send word when you're able to see her. I'll make sure she knows it's not indefinite." Evelyn looked at him. "You can't examine her?" "No," he agreed. "I wasn't going to examine her. I was going to talk to her." A pause. "About what?" "About whatever she needs to talk about while she waits," Sawyer said. "That's what you do when I'm in there with you, you know? You talk to them." She stared at him for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. And then she said in a voice that was marginally less sharp than usual, "She takes her tea without sugar, and she doesn't like to be talked at. Just let her talk if she wants." "I know," he said. "I've seen you do it enough times." She looked at him for another moment. Something crossed her face that was quiet and deep and didn't have a straightforward name. Then she sat back down at her desk and picked up her pen and said, "Fine," in the tone that meant she was grateful but wasn't going to make a production of it. He saw Mrs. Colby on Thursday. They sat on the porch because the day was clear and cold, and Mrs. Colby said she'd been inside too much. She talked about her husband's chest, which was better, and about her daughter who'd come to visit from Bozeman, and about the spring she was already planning. Sawyer listened and said the things that needed saying and sent her home with a note from Evelyn about what to watch for. She came in for her appointment 3 weeks later and said to Evelyn, "Your husband is good at listening." She said it like it was a discovery. "I know," Evelyn said. "I noticed that a while ago." The baby's name was Clara. She was 7 pounds 4 ounces, which Evelyn calculated with the same precision she applied to everything, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of looking directly at things with complete attention. She was not a quiet baby. She had opinions from the first week about what was acceptable to her and what was not, and she communicated these opinions without ambiguity. And Evelyn said she was just like her father, and Sawyer said she was clearly her mother's daughter, and neither of them was entirely wrong. The first weeks were the hardest and the most clarifying. Sawyer had thought, in the abstract way men thought about things before they happened, that he'd understood what it would mean. He had not understood. He understood now, at 2 a.m, with Clara against his chest, and the lamp turned low and the house quiet around them, that there was a weight to this that had nothing to do with difficulty. It was the weight of something permanent, something that changed the shape of every choice going forward. He held his daughter in the low light and felt the specific terror and wonder of it, the way those two things were almost the same thing, and he thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, standing on a frozen road waiting for a stagecoach with his hat in his hands, telling himself he didn't want romance. He'd been afraid. That was the plain truth of it. Not of loneliness. He'd made a kind of peace with loneliness, the way people made peace with the cold. He'd been afraid of this, of having something that mattered so much it could unmake him. Clara grabbed his finger in her sleep. Her grip was unreasonably strong. He sat there until the lamp burned down and the window went from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning, and he was still there when Evelyn came out from the bedroom, moving carefully, the way she moved in the recovery weeks, not gracefully, honestly, and stopped in the doorway and looked at them. She didn't say anything. She just stood there and looked, in the lamplight, with her hair loose and her face unguarded in the way it was only at this hour, when there was no one to present anything to. "Go back to bed," he said quietly. "In a minute," she said. She came and sat beside him, close, her head leaning toward his shoulder, though not quite on it, and they sat with their daughter asleep between them and the Montana morning coming up outside. And it was not a perfect moment. She was tired in a way that weeks hadn't fixed yet. He'd been up since midnight. Clara would wake soon and announce her displeasure with the world at full volume. But it was real in the way that only the imperfect things were real, stitched together from ordinary material into something that mattered completely. Old Pruitt died in the spring of 1879. He went quietly in his own bed, which was what he'd wanted, and which Evelyn had helped make possible by managing the lung condition that had been working on him since the previous fall. She had sat with him twice a week through the winter, and they had talked. About medicine, mostly. About the cases he remembered from his years as the territory's accidental physician. About the people he'd lost, and the ones he'd saved, and the ones that still came to him in the night, where the line between those categories had been too thin. He had given her, 2 weeks before he died, a worn leather notebook. 12 years of notes, he said. Not scientific, just what I learned. What worked and what didn't. What I wish I'd known. He coughed. Might be useful. Might be rubbish. She'd read it over 3 evenings with a look on her face that Sawyer had come to associate with her receiving something that mattered. She told him afterward that it was neither rubbish nor exactly scientific, but that it was something more valuable than either. It was the specific and hard-won knowledge of a man who'd worked with what he had in the conditions that existed, and that several things in it she hadn't known and would use. She had it recopied in a clean hand and sent a copy to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia with a letter proposing that the knowledge of frontier practitioners, barbers, midwives, the uncredentialed people who'd kept remote communities alive for decades, be formally documented and studied, because it contained things that medical schools didn't teach, because medical schools were not built in places where the nearest hospital was 2 days' ride. She did not hear back for 8 months. When she did, it was a letter from the college's director asking if she would be willing to contribute to a formal compilation. She sat on that letter for a week before she answered, thinking it through with the thoroughness she brought to decisions that would have long consequences. Then she wrote back and said yes, with conditions, that Pruitt's name appear on the document, that the knowledge of the territory's midwives be included alongside the physicians, and that the final document be made available at no cost to frontier practitioners who couldn't afford to purchase medical texts. The college agreed to 2 of the 3 conditions and negotiated the third to a reduced cost rather than no cost. Evelyn considered this an acceptable outcome and sent Harriet Coles a letter summarizing the negotiation, which Coles responded to with a telegram that said, "Well done. You should have been a lawyer. H.C." Thomas visited in the summer of 1879 and sat on the porch with Clara on his knee, which Clara permitted because she had assessed her uncle in the way she assessed everyone and found him acceptable. He was different at 40, Thomas. The laugh was still there, but it had some sediment in it now, the weight of years. He'd lost one of his hands in a late winter accident with a piece of equipment, not Dick's, the other one, a young man named Reeves who'd only been with him a season. It had hit Thomas harder than he let on. Sawyer knew this because Thomas didn't talk about it, and Thomas talked about most things. They sat on the porch after supper with the evening coming in long and gold, and Clara asleep inside with Evelyn, and Sawyer said, without leading up to it, "You want to talk about Reeves?" Thomas looked out at the mountains for a while. "Not particularly." "All right." A pause that stretched long enough to become comfortable. Then Thomas said, I should have had him on a different piece of equipment. He wasn't ready for that one. Maybe, Sawyer said. Not maybe. All right, not maybe. He looked at his brother. You going to carry it forever? Probably. Thomas said it without drama. That's how it works, isn't it? Some of them you put down and some of them stay. He looked at the mountains. You know that. Sawyer did know that. He had his own ones that stayed. The ranch hand he'd lost to a snake bite in the first year, who'd been 22 and from Ohio and had a letter in his pocket from his mother that Sawyer had sent on after with a note of his own that he'd never known if it was adequate. The calf he hadn't been able to save from the ice that first winter. The smaller ones. The accumulated weight of years of being responsible for things. Yeah, he said. I know. They sat with it. Clara made a small sound through the window and went quiet again. The mountains held their position against the fading sky. You're good, though, Thomas said, eventually. Not a question. Yeah, Sawyer said. I'm good. Thomas looked at the house, at the light in the windows, at the bench outside the clinic door that always had a quilt on it, at the ranch that had grown in the 3 years since Evelyn had arrived, into something unmistakably different from what it had been. She did that, he said. We did it, Sawyer said. Thomas gave him the look of a man who was going to let that stand because arguing it wasn't worth the trouble, but who had his own opinion. The second child, a boy they named James, arrived in the fall of 1880. He was easier than Clara in some ways and harder in others. He slept better and cried less, but he had an early and enthusiastic interest in putting things in his mouth that kept Evelyn in a state of low-level vigilance. He had Sawyer's dark hair and Evelyn's particular focused expression, the one she wore when she was deciding something, which on a 2-year-old had a quality that made Miguel laugh every time. Clara, for her part, received her brother with the tolerant interest of a person who has read about a phenomenon and finds the reality mostly consistent with expectations. She was 3.5 by then, already trailing after Evelyn through the clinic with the focused attention of a child who wanted to understand how things worked. Evelyn answered her questions with the same directness she gave her patients. Sawyer listened to these exchanges sometimes from the next room and thought about things he hadn't thought about yet, about what it meant to raise children in this place, what they would carry forward, what they would understand about the world because of what they saw in this house. He thought Clara would become a doctor. He didn't say it because it was far too early to put weight like that on a child's shoulders, but he thought it the way you thought things that felt true before you had proof of them. In 1881, Evelyn was asked to speak at a territorial medical conference in Helena. She was not the first woman to be asked, but she was the first licensed frontier practitioner to be invited as a featured speaker rather than a subject of discussion. The difference mattered, and she understood it precisely. She spent 2 weeks drafting what she wanted to say, working at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed, writing and crossing out and rewriting with the same concentrated attention she brought to patient notes. Sawyer read the draft she handed him one night and gave it back and said, "The middle section is what matters most. The beginning is too careful." She looked at him. "Too careful. You're warming up in the beginning, like you're not sure how much to say." He'd been married to her for 5 years. He knew the difference between her careful and her direct. "Just say the thing." She took the draft back and looked at it. Then she said, without looking up, "The thing is that women have been doing this work for decades without recognition, and the system that's now trying to license and regulate frontier medicine is building itself on their labor without crediting it, and the men chairing the committees know it and are hoping no one says it plainly." "That's the speech," Sawyer said. She looked up. "Say that," he said. "What you just said to me. That's it." She considered him for a moment. Then she turned back to the draft and started writing. The speech she gave in Helena was not comfortable for everyone in the room. She said plainly what the situation was, named the debt owed to the uncredentialed women who'd served as midwives and healers across the territory for years, named the specific inequities in how the new licensing framework had been constructed, and offered concrete changes that she'd already put to the governor's office in writing. She was not inflammatory. She was not soft. She spoke for 37 minutes without notes. There was a silence after she finished that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then a man in the second row started clapping, and then the room divided itself into the people who were applauding and the people who were not, and the division was informative. She came home and told Sawyer about the silence. "How long?" he asked. She thought, maybe 6 seconds. 6 seconds is a long time in a room full of people, he said. It felt longer, she admitted. What did you do? I waited, she said. I've learned that when I've said something true, the most powerful thing I can do is wait for the room to catch up. He smiled at that, and she caught it. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just thinking about the woman who got off a stagecoach in November of 1875. She looked at him with the expression that was complicated in its layers, the way her expressions often were, aware of what he meant, unwilling to be entirely sentimental about it, and underneath that moved. She was the same person, Evelyn said. She just didn't have anywhere to stand yet. That was true. He knew it was true, but he also knew that the place to stand wasn't only something she'd found. It was something they'd built together, with all the difficulty and compromise and accumulated ordinary days that building things required, and neither one of them had done it alone. He didn't say this because she knew it. By 1882, the Callahan Ranch had become, without either of them formally deciding this, something more than a cattle operation with a clinic in the back room. It was a stop on an informal network of frontier settlements, a place people knew they could come to. Not just for medicine, though that remained the center of it. For information, for resources, for the kind of help that was harder to name, but just as real. Evelyn had connections now, to Harriet Coles, to the Women's Medical College, to 2 other licensed practitioners in the territory she'd helped credential through the framework she'd had a hand in building. And those connections meant that a woman in trouble 40 miles east knew there was a place to go. A family that had lost their patriarch midwinter knew someone would come. An injured ranch hand without money knew that the clinic at Callahan Ranch had a policy about payment that was, at minimum, flexible. Sawyer had not been asked about that policy. He'd discovered it when he noticed that the ledger for clinic supplies showed regular expenses without regular corresponding income, and he'd raised it once, and Evelyn had looked at him with the measuring expression and said, "We have the money." "That's not what I asked." "Some people can pay and some can't," she said. "The ones who can't don't go without care because of it. We agreed on that a long time ago." "I don't remember agreeing. You told me to order what I needed," she said. "That was the agreement." He thought about the day she'd said that. The storage room newly cleaned, the instruments on the plank table, the anatomy book with its worn spine. He'd told her to order what she needed, and he'd meant it then, and he meant it now, and she'd known it, and she'd been quietly operating on that understanding for 6 years. "Fine," he said, the same way she said fine when she was grateful and not making a production of it. She went back to her notes. He updated the ledger to reflect the clinic as a fixed expense and didn't mention it again. Pete Dalloway got married in the fall of 1882 to a woman named Alma from Billings, who had opinions about everything and a laugh that could be heard from 2 barns away. They had a small wedding at the ranch, Pete had asked, with the formality of a man who'd been thinking about how to ask, and Evelyn organized it with the efficient energy she brought to projects that she'd quietly decided mattered, which meant the food was better than anyone expected, and the whole thing ran without visible effort, which those who knew her understood meant she'd been managing 17 details at once from the background. Sawyer stood beside Alma's father during the ceremony, and at one point looked across at Evelyn, who was standing on the other side of the gathered people with Clara on her hip and James asleep against her shoulder, and she was watching Pete and Alma with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself. The look of a person who'd gotten better at receiving good things, who was no longer braced against them. She caught him looking. She didn't change her expression. She just held his gaze for a moment, and in it was everything that didn't need to be said because it had already been said and said and said in 7 years of days. He looked back at Pete and Alma. The year James turned 2, he took his first independent steps across the clinic floor, toddling with the concentrated seriousness of a child attempting something difficult, and fell directly into the shelf where Evelyn kept the anatomy book. The book survived. James sustained a small cut on his forehead that Evelyn cleaned and closed with 2 tiny stitches, while Sawyer held the boy still, and Clara watched from the doorway with clinical interest. "Does it hurt?" Clara asked her brother. "Yes," James said with feeling. "Mama says the honest answer is always more useful than the comfortable one," Clara said. "Clara," Sawyer said. "What?" Evelyn looked up from the last stitch with an expression that was controlling itself. Nothing, Sawyer said. Later, after both children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat at the kitchen table in the low lamplight, and Evelyn said, with the particular tone she used for things she found darkly funny, "She quoted me at a 2-year-old. She quotes you constantly," Sawyer said. "I'm aware." A pause. "It's alarming." "It's something," he said. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. "She's going to be better than me," she said. It was quiet and not sad, more like a fact being named, the way she named facts. "She's going to have everything I had to fight for, and she's going to build on top of it. That's—" She stopped. "That's the whole point, isn't it? That's what all of it was for." He didn't say anything because she didn't need him to. In the spring of 1883, a young woman arrived at the ranch in the same way Evelyn had arrived 8 years earlier, by stagecoach to Harrow Creek, with heavy bags and a careful expression and the look of someone carrying something they'd been carrying a long time. Her name was May Sutton, and she'd trained 2 years at a medical college in New York before the funding collapsed, and she'd heard, through the network of connections that Evelyn had spent years quietly building, that there was a licensed physician in Montana Territory who sometimes took on assistants and finished what half-completed training had started. Evelyn met her on the porch. Sawyer stayed in the doorway and watched them. This woman who'd arrived at this same porch 8 years ago, and the young woman standing now where she had stood, and the particular quality of the way Evelyn looked at her, not measuring, recognizing. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "The coffee's on." May Sutton stayed 2 years. She left with a completed practical training, a letter of recommendation that Harriet Coles described as the most thorough she'd ever read, and the kind of grounded competence that came from 2 years of real work under someone who did not permit careless habits. She set up a practice in Bozeman and sent a letter back to Evelyn 6 months after she left, that Evelyn read at the kitchen table with an expression that Sawyer had learned to identify as the particular look of a person who has invested in something and watched it pay out. She was not the last. Over the following years, there were 3 more. A woman from Kansas, a man from Tennessee who'd trained as a surgeon's assistant during the war and had never found a way to formalize it, and a young Crow woman named Walks Far, whose knowledge of plant medicines Evelyn spent 6 months documenting alongside her own training because she'd learned from Pruitt's notebook that the specific and the local and the hard-won were exactly what got lost when formal institutions decided what counted as knowledge. Walks Far stayed the longest. She became, eventually, the practitioner for 3 communities north of Harrow Creek that had never had consistent medical care. And she came back to the Callahan Ranch twice a year for what she and Evelyn called continuing education, and what Sawyer called a week of 2 women talking medicine at the kitchen table while he kept the children from destroying the clinic. It was not a smooth history. None of it was smooth. There were years when the ranch finances were tight, and Sawyer lay awake doing arithmetic. There was a summer when a drought hit hard enough that 3 families in the territory lost their operations entirely, and Sawyer gave work to the men who needed it and deferred his own expansion plans for 2 years. And Evelyn saw twice as many patients that year because poverty and crisis and illness followed each other like weather systems. There was a winter when James got sick with something that sat in his chest and wouldn't move, and Evelyn treated her own son with the terrifying combination of complete clinical competence and the desperate love of a mother, which were 2 things that did not always sit comfortably alongside each other, and Sawyer held her together in the private hours by just being steady because that was what she needed, and he knew it. James recovered. It took 6 weeks and left them both thinner and quieter for a while. There was an afternoon in 1885 when a letter arrived from Boston that was not from Harriet Coles and not from the medical college. It was brief and formal, and informed Evelyn that Victor Ashcroft had died of a heart attack in November of the previous year. The letter was from his estate attorney, who had apparently been tasked with notifying certain parties. She read it and set it down. Sawyer looked at her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she did. "Yes," she said. "I don't feel what I expected to feel." "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Relief, maybe, or something more." She looked at the letter. He was afraid of exposure. That's all he ever was, underneath everything. A man afraid of what he'd done being known. She paused. "I spent years afraid of him, and he was just afraid too. He was afraid first." Sawyer sat with that. Does that change anything? He asked. No, she said, but it's clarifying. She folded the letter and put it in the stove and watched it burn with the methodical attention of someone completing a task. Then she stood and said, Clara has her mathematics lesson this afternoon. She's been avoiding the fractions. I know, he said. She told me they were an arbitrary system and she resented them. Evelyn looked at him. She's 7. She's 7 and she's yours, he said. She took her apron from the hook and tied it on and went to find her daughter, and Sawyer stayed at the table for a moment and looked at the stove where the letter had gone to nothing, and he thought, not for the first time, not in a dramatic way, just clearly, about how much courage it took to build a life. Not the confrontation and rifles kind of courage, though that too. The daily kind. The kind that got up when the arithmetic was bad and the winter was long and the fear was real and kept building anyway. The kind that came from not having any other acceptable option. He'd seen it in her from the first. He saw it still. He got up and went to find his family. The evening light in the spring of 1886 came in long and gold across the Montana plains, the way it had every spring for as long as anyone in the territory could remember, indifferent to what happened under it, and somehow more beautiful for that. Sawyer stood on the porch after supper and watched it. The ranch spread out in front of him, the barns rebuilt and expanded, the east pasture with the new herd, the kitchen garden that Evelyn had started in their second year and that had since grown to a thing of genuine productivity managed with the same systematic attention she gave everything. The bunkhouse where Miguel still lived, where Pete had lived before Alma and he built their own place 2 miles down the road. The clinic wing, which was no longer a storage room but a real addition to the house, built out properly 2 years ago with a waiting room and 2 examination rooms and a locked cabinet for the medicines that needed one. He could hear through the open window Evelyn drilling Clara on fractions at the kitchen table. Clara was not receptive. Evelyn was not relenting. James was in the kitchen too, making a periodic sound that suggested he found his sister's arithmetic struggles entertaining, which was periodically followed by Clara saying something to him in the tone of a person asserting authority, which was followed by silence. He stood there and listened to it. The particular music of a full house, imperfect and specific and irreplaceable. He thought about the man he'd been in 1875 standing on a frozen road with his hat in his hands. The advertisement he'd written. Not romance. Partnership. As if he'd known what he was asking for without knowing it. As if the thing he'd needed to say was already true before he had evidence for it. He'd been afraid of loss. That was the truth of it. He'd kept everything at a manageable distance because he'd learned in the hard years that the closer you held things, the more it cost when they were gone. He told himself that was wisdom. It was fear wearing wisdom's clothes. What he understood now, understood in the bone-deep way that only years could teach, was that the cost didn't go away when you kept your distance. It just changed shape. It became the cost of a life not fully lived, of rooms kept too empty, of a man who survived everything and let nothing matter. Evelyn had come off a stagecoach with a bag full of instruments and a secret she wasn't telling, and she had not been what he'd imagined, and she had been exactly what he'd needed, and the life they'd built was not beautiful because it was easy, but because it was real, because it was made of the actual material of days, arguments about the cattle rotation and bad coffee fixed over good coffee, and the weight of sick children and the satisfaction of a licensing bill passed, and the way she looked at him sometimes across a kitchen table as if she still found him surprising, which he tried to justify by continuing to be worth the look. Clara's voice came through the window, with the particular sound of a child who has finally, reluctantly, understood something. Oh. Yes, Evelyn said. Oh. A pause. Can we do the next one? Clara said, and her voice had changed, had the edge in it of someone who wants to try the thing they've just figured out. Sawyer smiled at the mountains. He didn't know everything that was coming. He knew the cattle market was going to be difficult next year. He'd heard enough from men he trusted to know the signs. He knew the licensing work was not done, that Evelyn would be writing to Helena again before the summer was out. He knew James was going to need a schooling arrangement soon that the territory had not yet figured out how to provide, and that Evelyn would probably end up having opinions about it that became proposals that became something official. He knew that Walks Far was coming in July, and that the 2 weeks she spent here were among the most productive of the year. He knew that Pete and Alma were expecting their first child, and that Pete had already asked, with the same formality with which he'd asked for the wedding, whether Evelyn would attend the birth. He knew all of this, and he didn't know what was past it, and that was all right. He'd learned that from her too, maybe. Or they'd learned it together. That the point was not to have certainty, but to have the people beside you worth being uncertain with. The light was going now, the gold deepening, the mountains going that specific shade of blue-gray that meant the day was finishing. Inside, he heard Evelyn close the arithmetic book and heard Clara immediately say something that made James laugh, the real laugh, the one that had no performance in it. He turned and went inside. The door closed behind him. The Montana night came down full and deep over the plains, over the ranch, over the clinic, and the barns, and the kitchen where the lamp was still burning and the family was still at the table. Stars came out in the clear mountain air, the kind of stars you only saw where there was enough darkness around them to see them properly. The land held everything under it. The years of hard winters and recovered springs, the graves of the people who'd worked it, the roads worn into it by wagons and horses, and the slow, ordinary movement of lives being lived. It didn't care about any of it, the land. It was just land. It would be here long after every name on it was forgotten. But the names mattered, the lives mattered. Not because the land remembered them, but because the people who came after would stand on what they'd built and stand higher for it. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. A woman had come off a stagecoach in November of 1875 with heavy bags and a secret she wasn't telling. And a man had been waiting on a frozen road trying to convince himself he knew what he wanted, and what happened after was not a story about courage in the dramatic sense, though courage was in it. It was a story about what people built when they decided to stop being afraid of the cost. It was a story about the ones who stayed,